Good morning. Good morning. Can everybody hear me? Yes, good. Well, first of all, thank you all for being here on time so we can get started. We have a great session for this group to talk about what the future will look like in terms of autonomous and connected vehicle technology and what those implications are for our society. My name is Maurice Henderson. I'm currently the Assistant Director at the Portland Bureau of Transportation. I know a few of the faces in the room, but glad to see a bunch of new ones here as well. I say currently because I just got announced. I was telling my fellow panelists that I'm going to be the incoming mayor's Chief of Staff and Director of Strategic Initiatives starting in January, so my head's been spinning a little bit since that announcement happened because it was a surprise to me as well. Just kidding. But we have three folks here on the panel with me who have really been thinking in this space for quite a bit of time, working with cities and states and government entities around the country on the questions around what does this autonomous vehicle future look like for us? What are the implications for people? And as many of you know, Portland was one of the 7 finalist cities for the Smart City Challenge that the US DOT just ran this past several months. While we were not a winner in that, and ultimately Columbus, Ohio was, which we congratulate them on that success and are at the table to work with them and help them develop and flesh out their plans for their smart city proposal. This has been a real opportunity for Portland and for our region and for our state to start thinking about larger questions around mobility and access and things of that nature. So I'll introduce our panelists, probably all of whom you know, but I think it's worth hearing a little bit about their background so you know where they're coming from on the topics that they're going to be discussing this morning. So Lauren Isaacs, who's going to kick it off for us, is the Manager of Sustainable Transportation at Parsons Brinckerhoff. Lauren is based in San Francisco. She's been involved with various projects involving advanced technologies that can improve the mobility in cities. In 2015, she was awarded the firm's William Barclay Parsons Fellowship for developing a guide titled Driving Towards Driverless, a guide for government agencies. And this was regarding how local and regional governments should respond to autonomous vehicles in the short, middle, and long term. And in addition, Lauren maintains a blog, Driving Towards Driverless, and has presented on this topic in at least 30 industry conferences, I believe, probably more than that now, 31. And was recently in a TED Talk, featured in a TED Talk, which I think had about 7,000, 8,000 viewers. It's really amazing. I actually watched it last night. That's how I know. It was riveting. So Lauren's going to kick it off for us. Then she's going to pass it off to Andrew Dick, who is now the Connected and Autonomous and Electric Vehicle, if I got it all right, Policy Advisor at the Oregon Department of Transportation. Andrew spent the last 7 years on electric vehicle policy and program implementation in 10 states and worked on the development of the California Zero Emissions Vehicle Program. He holds a bachelor's degree in international political economy from Colorado College. So thank you again for joining us, Andrew. And last but not least, to back clean up for us is Ashley Hand, who is one of the co-founders at CityFi, and she has brand new business cards for those who might want one. Ashley recently serves as the transportation technology strategist at the City of Los Angeles' Department of Transportation. As a fellow, she developed the public policy and action plan and pilot program recommendations for shared mobility, automated vehicles, and supporting transportation happiness to be released publicly in August of 2016. So it's right out, there you go. All right, prior to her role with the City of Los Angeles, she served as the Chief Innovation Officer with the City of Kansas City, who was also one of the Smart Cities finalists, by the way, Kansas City, Missouri, where she created the nation's most comprehensive smart city to date through a public-private partnership that utilized large companies and nimble startups to fulfill the city's goals and initiated the development of policy and operational framework to integrate technology into transportation, water, energy management for the city. As I mentioned, she just recently co-founded CityFi, a smart cities advisory company that helps create positive, sustainable change for people and for the economy through understanding new business models and cutting-edge solutions, as well as policy frameworks and approaches that cities can use to leverage current and new technology. So with that, I will turn it over to Lauren to start us off this morning. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I need to find my presentation here. No. Okay, so thank you for having me. So I'll just start with how I kind of got into this. I was reading about driverless vehicles. It was about 2.5 years ago, and I became really interested in them because what I quickly learned is that they are coming very, very quickly, and in fact, it's going to appear in a second. Yeah, okay. And in fact, this is something that really resonated for me. If you can't read it, it says driverless cars are closer than they appear. It really hit me that driverless cars are coming very, very soon, but what was interesting as I was reading news articles, which is really the main source of information around them, is that there was very little focus on what the government should be doing. You read all about Google and the car makers and who's going to come up with the technology first. You know, it's always a race, but very little on the government. So I applied for an internal research fellowship and I got it, and basically spent about 1.5 years researching driverless vehicles from the view of how government can plan for them. And what was great is that at the time when I started it, it wasn't on the radar at all. I mean, at the federal government level, federal government had done almost nothing at that point, and certainly at the state and local level, there was almost no mention. So now, thankfully, it's on the government's radar, and you'll hear a lot more about that. But so what I'm going to do very quickly is some background on driverless vehicles. I'll outline what I see as 2 potential extreme futures with driverless vehicles, and then finally I'll talk about what government can and should be doing. So first of all, driverless vehicles 101. So one of the things that the federal government did was to define driverless vehicles. So NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, came out with this definition. And really the key parts of this is that the driver will provide destination or navigation input, but they will not be available to take over control at any other part of the trip. So the driver in quotes, can literally be sleeping. And actually, I lost a slide there, but this is a better view of what that quote was. The graphic here is something from Mercedes. It's kind of a futuristic view of what driverless vehicles could look like on the inside. And what it demonstrates is how it could completely challenge what our traditional notions are of how a car is designed and how we sit in the cars. So that is just one of many renderings that are out there. The other thing that NHTSA did was establish different levels of automation. So level 0 is literally the way that cars were when they first came out. So you step on a brake when you want to stop, you turn the steering wheel when you want to turn. And that goes all the way up to level 4, which is the driver can literally be sleeping. The driver is not needed. These in-between levels reflects what we're seeing today, which is the introduction of partial automation. So we're starting to see in cars the ability to self-park, adaptive cruise control, just that the car is able to do some things automated and some things not. So my research has really been focused on level 4, full automation, but what we're finding is that these are being introduced gradually. So I'm going to show you a quick video, and hoping this works. And the question for you all is this a level 4 fully automated vehicle? And I don't know if you can see it, but that is a sleeping person in the car. He's fast asleep. So any guesses? No, that's right. So this is an example of a partially automated car where a person should not be sleeping, but they are. And that is a huge concern for the industry right now, is that things like what Tesla has with autopilot, these are vehicles that have partial automation, but we as humans think, wow, this is great, it can do it all for me. And that's actually illegal, what this person is doing now. So, all right. So, as I mentioned, there is quite the race to driverless, and it's not just between the automakers and the technology developers, Ford, Audi, Google, Tesla, everyone is out there with a new headline of who's got it, who has it coming out first. It's also between cities, between states, between countries. It's a really interesting time, and everybody wants, to take the trophy. But the real question is, when are they coming? So this is a graphic from Morgan Stanley, and what it shows is that we expect to see driverless vehicles become publicly available in the 2018 to 2020 timeframe. So that is literally in 2 to 4 years. That I think is really important because that means that even though they're going to start to become available, it doesn't mean that we're going to just see like pervasiveness around society. This graphic forecasts 100% penetration of driverless vehicles by 2026, which is 10 years from now. I happen to love showing this graphic because that is by far the most aggressive estimate that's out there. But that being said, I mean, we've even seen it with the adoption of smartphone technology. These things can happen very quickly. So that being said, I would say the average in terms of forecasts that we see out there show like 30 to 40% penetration in the 2030 timeframe. I think the most important thing to take away from this, though, is that most government plans look out 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and not many of them even acknowledge automated vehicles. So this, while aggressive, does kind of show you how soon they're coming. So what's the point of these vehicles? Why should the government care, I guess is the question. And the number one reason is the potential for improved safety. Right now, 90% of accidents that happen on our roadways are due to human error. So think drunk driving, distracted driving, speeding. When you have a vehicle that eliminates the human, you have the potential to eliminate all of those accidents. The other big one is the potential for increased mobility. So Google has done a lot to promote, the blind guy getting into the vehicle and him being able to get around. It's very interesting when California DMV came out with regulations in the last 6 months that required a steering wheel and brakes, and for a driver to be able to take over control at any time. It was actually the disabled community that came out in full force to protest that because it has such an impact on their group. And finally, the potential for reduced car ownership. So what if this 2-car garage was able to become more of this like Uber and Lyft-like society? And I like to take the Uber icon out and put a public agency into this phone because it's important to reflect the fact that there are different business models that we are likely going to see with how these vehicles actually do provide the service. So what's keeping driverless vehicles from happening right now? So technology is obviously one piece of it, and then the question is also, how ready does the technology need to be? But other things are like human factors. How many of you would get into a driverless vehicle right now if there was one waiting for you outside? What a progressive audience. No, it was probably like 50%. That's actually pretty close to where we are as a country in terms of readiness, but it ranges significantly based on age of people, where you live. I gave this talk in Connecticut, which is where I'm from, to about a room of about 200 people, and I had one person willing to get into a driverless vehicle, so you just never know. But that is a huge piece, and it's actually the industry is really recognizing is the need for humans to actually be willing to get into the vehicles, and people on both the public sector side and private sector side are really starting to invest in this. Just skipping around, another major issue is the privacy and security. Who's going to own and protect the travel data? Who's going to make sure that these cars are not taken over by terrorists and driven into buildings? This is something the federal government is investing a good amount of money in right now. And then another big one is insurance. Who's liable if a driverless vehicle gets into an accident with another driverless vehicle, or even more complicated with a non-driverless vehicle? Where does the fault lie? So these are all some very interesting questions that are being studied by many, many different people, including academic institutions. But the government's role is really what I started to focus on and I got really interested in, so I'll talk about that more in a second. So in terms of our future, I like to lay out 2 very extreme futuristic scenarios, purposely extreme for the purposes of demonstration. So imagine like fast forward 50 years from now, we have all driverless vehicles. So what does that look like? So first scenario 1, imagine that I'm a suburban mom. I live out 15 miles outside of a city. I wake up on a Monday morning, get my kids ready for school, and then I summon my private driverless vehicle to come and pick me up. So it shows up at my door, I put my kids into the vehicle, and the vehicle takes my kids to school. Then when the car comes back, I'm ready to go, so I get in so that the car can take me to work. I get into the car. It has a coffee maker, an elliptical trainer so I can get my workout in. It has a big screen TV, and then after I get my workout in, I sit and I watch some TV and I start getting some work done. And I'm probably sitting in traffic for a lot of that, but I really don't care because I have the luxury of this vehicle and everything I could need inside of it. So then I get to the office. I realize I don't have any groceries for dinner that night, so I send the vehicle out to run my errands for me. So while I'm at work, I tell the car to go to one store for produce, because it's the cheapest there, a different store for meat, and another store for toilet paper, because I got the cheapest deals at each one of these stores. And then once the vehicle is done picking up all of those things, it drives to a remote parking lot about 15 miles outside of the city to wait for its next assignment. So that's scenario one. You'll notice that there is definitely no public transportation involved in that. Well, it's actually a pretty scary scenario. A lot of people think of that as like the dream. I have had a lot, after the TED Talk actually, I had at least 10 different moms come up to me and say, that was exactly what I want to have happen in my future. And I said, that's not the point, that's not what I was trying to say. But the issue is, you're now, instead of just having single occupancy vehicle trips, you're actually adding a lot of zero occupancy vehicle trips to the road. And on top of that, there's no minimal public transportation. So it's kind of the selfish scenario, but not too different from how we use cars today. So that's scenario one. Scenario two is quite the opposite. So imagine the exact same thing. I wake up on a Monday morning, I get my kids ready for school, and then I get them onto a driverless school bus. And the bus takes them to school. And then when I'm ready to go, I use my smartphone and I summon a pod to come pick me up. And this driverless pod picks me up, picks up a couple of my neighbors, and then takes me to the local train station. And there it's timed perfectly. So I get out of the pod, I immediately get onto the train, and the whole thing is paid for seamlessly. And then I get to the downtown, get on a bike share bike for that last mile, and then head into my office. So similarly, I realize I don't have any groceries for dinner that night, so I use my smartphone and I schedule a food delivery for that evening. I'm sure a lot of you today use Instacart and that kind of thing, so not too crazy from how we work today. So that's scenario two. So really the big difference between these two is the level of sharing that's happening, the level of vehicle and ride sharing. And I do believe our reality is going to be somewhere in the middle. But the key with this is that I actually think that it's the government's policies and plans that are put in place that will influence where we fall on this spectrum. So just very quickly to compare these two scenarios, and some of these are controversial, and that's just fine. I'm happy to argue them. So in terms of comparing these two scenarios, so I have the nightmare scenario on the left, hopefully you know which one is which, and then the utopian scenario on the right. So when it comes to safety is going to be drastically improved no matter what, because we have all driverless vehicles. Vehicle miles traveled could be way, way, way worse with the nightmare scenario, but it actually is likely to be still worse with the utopian scenario. That's what most forecasters are saying, just when you consider the level of trips that are still going to happen to pick people up and time when there's no one in the car. Greenhouse gas emissions, so this is probably one of the more controversial ones, but I will just say most forecasts assume that driverless vehicles are going to be electric. And that is a huge assumption. It's a huge leap of faith to make because they are two totally different technologies. So I think it's really important from a government perspective when forecasting these things, that is a policy that needs to be put in place to be able to influence how that happens. Urban sprawl, there is the risk with driverless vehicles that people are willing to live farther from where they work. Whereas in the utopian scenario, in theory, people would live in denser, richer transit communities so that they don't have to do these long commutes in a private vehicle. Parking requirements, I say no change for the nightmare scenario. The biggest change, there would be a change likely, is that parking could be relocated. So as I said, the remote parking lots, you might be able to move parking lots outside of the urban areas and away since the vehicles can travel to them. And then on the utopian side, there would be a significant decrease in the parking requirements, which could be huge for our both downtown and suburban communities if that parking can go down. Roadway maintenance requirements. In theory, it would go down in both cases because driverless vehicles are expected to have smoother acceleration and deceleration. However, with the increase in VMT, the nightmare scenario would, in theory, have still more roadway maintenance requirements than the utopian. And finally, low-income mobility. Public transportation is really at the heart of the utopian scenario, and the idea is that it would be something that the government invests in and really makes rich and reliable and frequent. And in the nightmare scenario, there is the risk that public transportation just goes away. And that is something that I don't believe is fully gonna happen, but I think that is a risk. So jumping into what can governments do. So as Maurice mentioned, I developed a guide. I have about 10 that I can give away after this, but in the guide I laid out what government agencies can do in the short, medium, and long term. So just to start, I thought the first thing I need to do is break down what should the federal government be focused on versus state and local. And the idea is that at the federal level, you want to see consistency across the states. You do not want to have different requirements around, for example, licenses. I mean, our driving license is still going to be needed. Our seatbelt requirements going to change. I mean, these are things you do not want to have to, the auto manufacturers are not going to want to develop differently state by state. Same with the privacy and data sharing, cybersecurity. These are all things you want to see consistently around the country. On the other hand, state and local role, you're going to want to see those jurisdictions focused on the things that are unique to their region. So mobility, how do they want to manage that vehicle miles traveled impact? On the infrastructure side, are you going to have to add more kiss and ride drop-off points at your transit stations to be able to get more to enable more sharing? Where are you going to move parking to? How are you going to manage that parking demand? So these are all infrastructure impacts. Transit, I like to say transit even today is going through an identity crisis to figure out how to manage this kind of, even with the Uber and Lyfts of the world and other private companies coming into what's traditionally been a public sector space. Transit needs to figure out its role in all of this, and I think that's that much more important as driverless vehicles come in, because the private sector is very much coming into this space and providing comparable services. And then the financial piece. This is something that's often overlooked, but there are going to be huge financial implications for government agencies. Think about speeding ticket revenues. Speeding tickets could completely go away, and there are towns in our country that rely on that. Another big one is sales tax revenues that come with vehicle purchases. If people are going to buy less vehicles, the sales tax revenues that come from that could go down. So there's really a laundry list of financial implications. So what can be done now? I'm just going to highlight a few of these. The number one thing I think government agencies can do is to build up their own awareness about what's going on. It's been a super exciting place for me, and I think all of us on the panel, because the news changes daily. I mean, there's something new and crazy going on around the world with driverless vehicles, new things being tested. There are driverless shuttles on the roads today around the world. Singapore just introduced driverless taxis. I mean, it is literally disrupting the entire transportation space. So keeping up with what's going on and then helping to build awareness around the agencies and with your public is really, really important. The other thing is to start to incorporate driverless vehicles into your plans, into your goals. Even if you don't know exactly what the future is going to be, acknowledging that they're coming and then starting to lay out where it could impact things is really important. And I'll keep going from that. And then what can be done in the medium and long term? From the planning perspective, starting to look at your travel demand model. Government agencies, most of them maintain a travel demand model, and most of them do not even incorporate Uber and Lyft when you think about what the extreme consequences already have been on transportation. But by updating travel demand models, even with these extreme scenarios, you can start to look at what my road capacity needs might be, how might parking requirements change, and then look at how that impacts transit. On the infrastructure side, I will just say, and I love to skip to this because there are quite a few infrastructure impacts. Even though driverless vehicles don't actually speak to the infrastructure, they don't rely on the infrastructure in the same way that connected vehicles do. Driverless vehicles will still have some changes. It might be changing the traffic signalization. It might be updating your lane markings and making sure that they are able to be read by the driverless vehicles. But one of the most controversial things that I have in my guide is the idea of certifying roads so that driverless vehicles can operate on them. When I sent this guide out for review around to both public and private sector, this was by far one of the most controversial things, in that some people said, well, absolutely, why would anyone trust getting into a driverless vehicle if the government hasn't certified that a road is able to, or that it's dedicated just to driverless or just to non-driverless? And then government agencies were saying, well, we don't have the money to do that. We don't want to be liable if something goes wrong on that road. There were quite a few reasons against it, but I kept it in just because there were so many people that came out and said, absolutely, it's the only way we're going to see driverless vehicles come into our society. So it is a controversial thing. And another one I'll highlight, which is under the miscellaneous category, is the importance of updating the government workforce to be able to reflect the skill sets needed to manage this disruption. One thing is that a ton of new data is going to be available. So the government's going to need to be in a position to establish policies to be able to actually access that data, and then have skills to be able to do something with the data. I mean, it's amazing how many government agencies today are fighting for data, for example, like from Uber and Lyft, and they don't necessarily have the skills to be able to do anything with it, or what do they want to do with it is the question. So I think that's really important. And then finally, and this is my all-time favorite slide, which I'll do very quickly, when I said that there's this spectrum where we're likely going to fall between the utopian and nightmare scenario, it's really going to be government policy that influences where the society falls in that spectrum. And it's going to be important to put out policies that will manage the VMT impact. So putting things like HOV lanes and road user charging and things where people actually understand that the more they travel, the more they pay, or maybe there are incentives for sharing rides. These are all ways to make sure that we lean more towards that utopian scenario. And the other thing I'll mention is changing transit pricing. Uber and Lyft may be cheap now, but it's only going to get cheaper when there are no drivers in them. And it's going to be super important that public transit stays competitive, and pricing is one of the best ways it can stay competitive. So I could go on and on. The guide has a lot more. It's available online too. I will just say the biggest takeaway that I like people to walk away with is that government really has an important role to play. Private sector is going to advance this technology with or without government, and it is so important to realize the importance of what this is going to do for our society, both the positives and the potential negatives, and that the government has a role in influencing that. So with that, I'll leave you with my contact information, and there is a link to the guide. You can also just Google it. It's a lot easier to Google it. It's called Driving Towards Driverless, and my blog, and I tweet about driverless vehicles all the time, so if you're looking for a way to stay up to date on these news articles, that can be a great way. So thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.
Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew Dick. I'm the Connected, Automated, and Electric Vehicle Advisor for the Oregon Department of Transportation. Thank you, Lauren, for the great introduction. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the way that state governments are responding to this new technology around the country, and then specifically the efforts that Oregon Department of Transportation has underway. All right, so first off, what are the benefits of AVs that are of interest to public agencies? What are we trying to achieve? We see a lot of safety benefits. About 90% of crashes, 5 to 6 million of them in the US annually, are caused by driver error. They're caused by people who aren't paying attention or who lose control of the vehicle or who otherwise cause a crash. That causes about 35,000 traffic deaths annually, and more than 400 of those are in Oregon. So we really, from the safety perspective, see the opportunity to leverage these technologies in a way that causes these vehicles to be more safe. Secondly, mobility. We want people to be able to get around. There are people who are constrained in their mobility because they are low income or because they are disabled or because they live far away from city centers or other places that they want to go. And driverless vehicles would give them more mobility. Efficiency in the environment. Coordinated vehicles can accelerate at the same time, they can brake at the same time. You have less gridlock, you have a more efficient use of the transportation system, and with that you have less time idling and less time stuck in traffic, and so you have less emissions. And basically just improved operation of the network overall. If you have vehicles that are all communicating to each other and optimizing traffic flows, you see a lot less congestion and so on. But AVs also have associated risks that we need to manage as a government agency. The safety of the autonomous driving systems is one. How do you know that the vehicles are safe? computer security and data privacy. You may have seen the sort of high-profile hacking of a Jeep. It was a white hat hacker, so everybody knew that test was going on, but really it was to prove that computer systems in vehicles right now have so much control over their operation that if somebody with malicious intent gets into those systems, they can really take control of that vehicle in a way that might be dangerous. Changing demands on transportation agencies. This is a risk for us as an organization because we need to be prepared for what's coming. We need to understand what these vehicles are going to need out of the transportation system, like machine-readable infrastructure, in order to operate safely on our roads. And lastly, will we have increased travel demand? Will we have zero occupancy VMT? Those were a couple issues that Lauren talked about, but we've been so concerned about moving people to these multimodal systems, public transit, trying to get people out of single occupancy vehicles. But we're actually raising the specter of moving to zero occupancy VMT and potentially quite a bit of it if we don't manage the deployment of these vehicles well. So the question is, how do we prepare for AVs in a way where we can mitigate those risks but capture all the great benefits that we think this technology can provide? So I'm going to go through some of the different approaches that states have put into practice so far. It's worth noting that many states at this point are waiting for guidance from NHTSA on a policy framework for AVs. Oregon is one among many states that actually had a bill on autonomous vehicles in its legislature in the past couple sessions, and then was urged by Google and was urged by the other automotive manufacturers to hold off on establishing yet another framework for AV testing. The concern is that there is a patchwork of regulations emerging, and as Lauren said, it becomes an issue if you have a vehicle that's licensed only in one state, but not in another state, and then not in another state. So, generally we like to have sort of harmonized guidelines for technology that can be used across the country, harmonized guidelines for vehicles that can be sold in different states, and for the types of infrastructure that are in different states, so any vehicles and drivers can operate there. But there are some states that do have testing underway. Other states are looking at encouraging new testing. And so some of those are passing AV legislation or taking other governmental action in order to support that testing. So what are the state responsibilities in regulating these technologies? Well, different states have had sort of different philosophical approaches to this in terms of, what is the role of the state at this point? What should the state require of people who are trying to operate these vehicles on the roads? So here's a map of states with enacted autonomous vehicle legislation to date. Some of these are very sort of minor at this point. For instance, North Dakota and Utah have just passed legislation saying that there needs to be a study of how these technologies will impact them. Tennessee passed a law saying that local governments couldn't make laws prohibiting AVs, and then this year sort of expanded on that a little bit. Louisiana and DC have just added a definition of an autonomous vehicle or automated driving. One of the interesting things about the driving codes in most of the states is that nobody ever specified that a human had to be the driver because it wouldn't have occurred to them back when they were being written. So there are problems just with definitions, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. So the remaining states here, Florida, Michigan, Arizona, Nevada, California, they're all actually sort of implementing a scheme that relates to automated vehicle testing and different ways of regulating them. So I'm going to zero in on California first and give a sense of how they've approached this issue. So going back all the way to 2012, the California legislature passed a bill directing their Department of Motor Vehicles to develop regulations surrounding automated vehicles. They divided it into two phases. There's a testing and the operations phase. We're not quite to the operations phase yet, so these are the requirements for the testing phase. First, if you're a manufacturer, you have to apply to DMV for a vehicle testing permit. You need to register your automated vehicle. You have to show your proof of ownership. You have to give a description of the automated vehicle technology. You need third-party certification of vehicle safety. So you need to get an outside entity that has knowledge of the California Vehicle Code and safety systems and the automated systems and so on to provide verification that your vehicle safety system can operate correctly. You need $5 million insurance requirements so that if anything happens to go wrong with the vehicle, you know that you can cover the damages. You need an event data recorder to record info on the automated vehicle system, and then there are many additional reporting requirements. You have to report accidents, disengagements of the AV system, make these publicly available, make them available to the state as well, so that any incident relating to the vehicle is reported. You need a driver in the driver's seat who's able to take control of the vehicle, which effectively, as Lauren said, translated into a requirement that you have a steering wheel, brake pedal, accelerator in the vehicle, which some manufacturers didn't actually want to do. And so on. There are other requirements as well, driver licensing and so on. So I'm going to contrast that with Texas's approach to this, which is basically come on down. Texas actually wasn't on that map. They haven't made any laws surrounding AVs, and so when Google started to develop their second round prototype, you see this is their first round prototype. This is a modified Lexus SUV, so it has all the original controls in it in terms of a steering wheel and brakes and so on. But when Google started to develop their second round vehicle, which does not have a steering wheel or brakes, they took it to Austin, and that's where they're doing the testing. And Google's philosophy on that is really that it's a liability if you ever have a situation where there's confusion about whether the driver should or should not be in control of the vehicle. What happens to Lauren's driver who's asleep in his blue Tesla if suddenly traffic picks up and suddenly everybody's moving 55 miles an hour, or suddenly the road conditions change, or you approach a situation that's unsafe? Google said we should never have that sort of confusion, or even the potential for that confusion about whether or not there's a driver or not a driver in control of the vehicle. So they've taken that to Texas, where they can do more testing with that concept. So some of the short-term policy questions, just to generalize about what California was asking and what other states are asking. How do you determine that vehicles are safe? A lot of times states don't actually have a role in determining the safety of systems. Most states, especially smaller states, really aren't staffed in a way that you can have experts who can make that determination. So typically that is regulated by the federal government. What vehicles are allowed? Who can operate them? California came up with this, you need registration, you need certification and so on. You need licensed drivers. Eventually, though, you might need you might be able to put your kids in a driverless vehicle because, why should they even be required to have a driver's license if they're not going to do any driving? Does a human need to be able to intervene? At least in the short term, this is something that's been put into practice in a lot of the testing regimes, is that you need to have somebody, even if they're not physically in the vehicle, able to take control should the system fail. Another question is, what constitutes a driver? Does an AV system constitute a driver? Well, NHTSA wrote a letter to Google saying that it does. But that starts to cause conflicts with existing law. For instance, in New York, there's a requirement that a driver have one hand on the wheel at all times, which is difficult if you don't have hands. There are other requirements that, for instance, that drivers report accidents. So a vehicle can't maybe directly report an accident. And then many states have requirements that if a vehicle is in a collision, the driver needs to stay at the scene and then render aid. So you can imagine an automated vehicle trying to be useful after a collision. So there actually are substantial sections of driver codes that states need to look at and potentially revise as this technology approaches sort of widespread deployment, and we need to resolve those conflicts. Who's liable if an AV crashes? We mentioned that before. And then lastly, one of the interesting ones is, how do you ensure that AV regulation doesn't outpace technology development? And so the question there is, if you work with maybe one manufacturer and they come to you and they have a great technology and you put into practice a regulatory scheme that's very specific to that technology and requires certain performance characteristics or vehicle characteristics that just relate to that one test, then what happens when someone else comes along with a different technology that doesn't fit into that framework? If you put yourself in the position of having to completely reopen your framework every time a new technology comes out, then that can be an enormous burden. In the longer term, agencies have even more questions that we're going to be really interested in addressing. So what are the impacts on VMT? We've heard projections that VMT could go up, that VMT could go down, depending on what the degree of sharing and how people are using the vehicles, whether people will tolerate longer trips, if there are effects on urban growth and commute distances. If people can be using their time productively when they're sitting in an automated vehicle, then maybe they'll tolerate living 50 miles outside where they work, and they'll just work on the way into the city. How are autonomous vehicles going to impact employment? This is, an issue that came up in some discussions with our legislature. Is this going to create a bunch of engineering jobs for Oregon? Is it going to be a boon for employment? Is there a way that we can use this in a way that supports economic development in the state? And then on the other side, what does this mean for truck drivers? What does this mean for taxi cab drivers? What does this mean for everyone who earns a living that way and it could become another sector where people see that their jobs are replaced by automation? And then how are AVs going to change expectations of transportation agencies is another one. Maintaining infrastructure that can be read by vehicles. ODOT is represented on a committee that designs uniform traffic control devices. So it makes sure that stop signs and pavement markings and so forth are identical from state to state, or at least within similar tolerances. And in the future, if you have automated vehicles that need to be able to read the infrastructure and their sensors need a specific configuration or specific materials, then we need to be aware of that. Again, the agency might have a much bigger role in data analysis, in deploying roadside infrastructure, in looking at real-time traffic information and doing active traffic management based on the data that we're collecting. This is a really interesting transition for transportation agencies because historically, you go out, you collect some data, you bring it back, you build a model. And then you look at your system sort of from this modeling standpoint and try to figure out how you can address transportation challenges based on this data that you collected at a specific point in time. In the future, we're going to be collecting so much data in real time that we're really going to be moving towards a different operational paradigm where we don't come back and do a bunch of analysis and then go out and make changes, but where we can actually modify the system in order to improve operations in real time. But that's a shift for the agency and a move towards data analysis and data management in a way that hasn't been a focus maybe of a lot of transportation agencies to date. What does safety and incident response look like in a world of crashless cars? So, we might need to staff up on network engineers and on data analysts and so on. But at the same time, if we eliminate 90% of our crashes, then we might have much less of a role in safety and incident response because we'll have so many fewer incidents to respond to. So all of this results in the need for a lot of workforce development. As Lauren said, there's something new about this in the papers or online every day. And really what we want to do as an agency is ensure that our staff is hearing it from us before they're hearing it from outside, so that they understand that we have a plan surrounding this. They understand sort of how the agency's role might change, and so that they're prepared and that they gain the skills for acting in those new capacities. So ODOT's approach specifically, we've created a connected and automated vehicle steering team. We have high-level staff from different agency divisions. So we have people from transportation safety. We have people from intelligent transportation systems. We engage with the Oregon State Police, our long-term planning, basically just everyone across the agency where these technologies might have an impact. And we really sort of concluded that it is agency-wide. They come to this steering team so we can sort of exchange information and talk through how different things might affect agency operations. We review upcoming connected vehicle and automated vehicle technologies, put together tools where we can sort of analyze them and look at what they might look like in the state of Oregon, identify the impacts on different segments of the agency, and identify impacts on operations and if there are any consequences to the safety of the system. From that, we determine research and pilot priorities. We figure out if there are ways that we can get hands-on experience, or if we need research projects to learn more about what the impacts might be. And then we use that information to manage our internal and external outreach and education. So not just doing workforce development for the folks who are working for ODOT, but also engaging with the public, letting them know what these technologies are, how the agency is responding to them, and that there are paradigms in place to ensure the safety of the system. And using all of that, we sort of build this plan for how the agency will evolve in response to the technology. So I'm going to look at just one technology and a couple of the tools that we have built to analyze that and how it might impact the system, which is truck platooning. Truck platooning is already being tested in Nevada. I think it's about to be tested in a couple other states in the U.S. It's undergone extensive testing in Europe. And the idea between truck platooning is that two trucks use wireless communications and coordinate their accelerating, braking, sometimes their turning, in order to make sure that they can safely operate much more closely than you normally could. So you have trucks driving almost, about 36 feet apart at highway speeds. This improves aerodynamics for both trucks. You have sort of have the leading truck is clearing a path for the one behind it. There's less wind resistance, and there end up being about 5% fuel savings for the lead truck and 10% fuel savings for the trailing truck. And in the context of the U.S. motor carrier industry, which spends over $100 billion a year on fuel, there could be a powerful motivator for economic development here. We were talking with one company that said, when we're interested in developing efficiency improvements to our vehicles, to our trucks, we're at the point where we're trying to get sometimes fractions of a percent. We're looking at 0.3%, 0.1% in terms of what that technology could do. And so a 7% increase in fuel savings is really substantial. It's an order of magnitude bigger than a lot of the savings that manufacturers typically look at when they try to increase efficiency. But what does that mean for Oregon? How do we ensure safety? We look at the way that these operate on our roadways, and we try to think about the consequences in terms of how other road users are going to interact with that technology. So the earlier image I showed you was just sort of two trucks. But this is a test that happened in the Netherlands, where you have more than a dozen trucks in a platoon. And if you can imagine, if you were trying to get on or get off of a freeway while this was passing, that would be very difficult. It could be just blocked for a mile. So there's a question, how do we ensure that vehicles will safely be able to come on or leave the freeway? What stretches of the roadway do we allow platooning? At what times of day? In what weather conditions? Do we want to allow this at rush hour in Portland where the interchanges are very close together? Do we want to allow it in more rural settings where the interchanges are further apart? Another one is bridge loading. Does this cause greater bridge loading than our current triple trailers? So we looked into that and found that platoons of up to 4 fully loaded semis would be able to go across all the bridges in Oregon that don't have weight restrictions on them currently. So here's an example of a GIS tool that we're building. This is the number of lanes. So this is one potential strategy that we thought we might use to address the impact of truck platooning on the highway. If people are having trouble getting on or off that rightmost lane, maybe you restrict the use of these to areas that are yellow or better. Areas that are yellow are areas where you have at least 3 lanes on the highway. You could restrict that platooning trucks only use the middle lane, and so you have the passing lane on the left and you have the sort of empty lane on the right that stays open for vehicles that are getting on or off. This is one that shows the distance between interchanges. And so you can see that if you get into a more urban area like Salem, they get a lot closer together. Orange and red mean that they're, I think, less than 3 miles apart. But if you get down, south of Salem and into the area between Salem and Eugene, you start to get much longer stretches of highway. So that's another way of addressing that merging question, which is that if you have much longer distances between interchanges, there's less of a chance that a vehicle is coming on, depending on your traffic patterns, at the same time that a platoon would be passing. So we have a number of ongoing efforts. We just want to keep tracking development of AV technology. We do that just, not only just by reading the news and so on, but also by engaging with other states and national efforts on AV deployment. So we work a lot with AASHTO, the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials. They lead a lot of great information sharing forums where different states can compare notes on what they're thinking about. AMVA is the equivalent to that for motor vehicle administrations. We're also participating in the National Cooperative Highway Research Project, which has a project surrounding connected and automated vehicles, which is doing some sort of forward-thinking research into the way that these vehicles will be used in our system. We're building relationships with stakeholders. At this point, ODOT really doesn't have a formal role. As I mentioned earlier, we were one of those states where creating our own testing paradigm was discouraged. So at this point, we don't have a formal role in approving or disapproving these technologies. So we have a role in building relationships so that we can have a back and forth with a company that wants to do something in Oregon, and we can work through those safety and operational issues even if we're not the regulating agency at this point in time. And then lastly, we just want to develop strategies to ensure that ODOT is responsive to these new technologies, that we're prepared for their deployment, but that we're also responsible in our mission of preserving public safety. So thank you very much. There's my contact information. And with that, I'll pass it over to Ashley.
Good morning. Quick poll. Who in the room considers themselves academics? Public sector? Private sector? Excellent. Well, now that I know a little bit about you, I am Ashley Hand. And as Maurice mentioned, I just recently finished a one-year fellowship with the City of Los Angeles, funded in part by the Goldhurst Foundation in partnership with the Mayor's Fund of Los Angeles to develop a transportation technology strategy. So as you've heard, there's a lot of concern about the lack of involvement at the local government level in defining what this future of automated vehicles looks like. But Selena Reynolds, the general manager of LADOT, wanted to be aggressive and wanted to hire a futurist. Well, the mayor's team was a little concerned about calling someone a futurist and bringing them into government, so I was the strategist. And I was okay to play with that role, because I think it is really important for us as members of the community that have a different set of priorities than the technology companies and the OEMs that are developing this incredible technology to define what the cities of our future should look like, how it will serve our community as a whole, protecting interests around safety, equity, access, and sustainability, all that things that we've clearly defined in our policy goals as a city. So I think if you know anything about Los Angeles, you know that we're auto-centric. There is certainly a passion for vehicles. And when I tried to explain to my father what I was going to be doing for this one-year fellowship when I relocated back to Los Angeles, he told me there is no way in his lifetime he would ever give up driving. And that's true, and I understand that, and he's probably not alone, particularly in a city like Los Angeles. But the reality is my father, like others, are aging, and his ability and his mobility will change with time. And so the ability to get into a vehicle that doesn't require him as a driver may actually be something that he will desire in the future. Don't tell him I said that. We also dedicate a significant amount of our infrastructure and very valuable land to support the current status quo, the single occupancy vehicle. And when we think about the challenges of affordable housing and mobility as a whole, this seems like a very wasted and unfruitful strategy. So we wanted to design a strategy that looked at a few core issues. Shared mobility as a mechanism to enhance the existing capacity of our roadways as they are today by improving the capacity of the vehicles that are on the road. We also wanted to think about what that quality of experience might be and really think about transportation happiness as a new metric to understand how we evaluate public and private services that are using the public right-of-way to move people around. We know from studies from across the country, and even in cities like Montreal, where I lived for a while, and it can be very cold there, that even if your commute is longer, if you are using active modes of transportation or public transportation, you are actually happier and enjoy that commute more, and that contributes to your overall well-being, your public health, and frankly, to the community as a whole. And then there's this kind of big question mark of what do we do about automated vehicles as a city? Because obviously, and I think both Andrew and Lauren have defined, there are a lot of things that the city just isn't in control of. So what do we have an influence on as a city? We've heard about the safety improvements and what the impact will be, and with our Vision Zero commitment as the City of Los Angeles, we certainly saw that this would be a critical opportunity for us to invest in a future that would save lives on our streets. And so how could we potentially optimize what this future would look like? We have to envision a shared future. And I think that is a huge challenge because it is a fundamental change in our behavior as travelers. But the reality is that if we want to use the existing infrastructure that we have today as effectively and efficiently as possible, we need to shift behavior. And we need to start today by laying the groundwork through incentives and disincentives to change that behavior. So our vision is to create a future that increases our mobility, improves safety and access, and ultimately creates great streets, because this is our public space. And if we redefine our cities as civic space, all of a sudden we're changing the nature of our neighborhoods and our communities as a whole. Now, I've worked in innovation in government for a while, and I can tell you that one of the challenges for government is how do you adapt as quickly as everyone else? Because there is a certain strength in being a little bit slower to change. And that is one of the things that our community actually depends on, that consistency of how we will act and respond to situations. But the reality is we need to start thinking differently by establishing a platform for innovation that allows us to accept this change at a faster rate without necessarily creating greater uncertainty in our cities. So I propose a series of actions to get us there. And ultimately, what I'd like to see and what we envision is a platform that looks at 3 core services, which I'll define a little bit later, but look at data as a service, mobility as a service, and infrastructure as a service. This is the kind of 3 primary outcomes of what the Department of Transportation in the future will provide to its city. So the first action is, again, focusing on data, clearly the currency of today and ultimately the currency of the future. So we need to think about how we set the right policies today to create the transparency and accountability with the use of data to ensure that our citizens are comfortable with what we are doing in our public right-of-way when it comes to collecting and analyzing this information. And ultimately, we want to define what can be shared, how it will be used, and what you have rights as a community member in terms of protecting your own personal privacy. But we also have to look within the organization and unlock the data resources that we currently have. So government is structured in silos. That's how we budget. That's how we finance our work. And ultimately, we have tons of information that is completely underutilized. So unlocking that data and understanding what we have within our own organizations goes far beyond the open data movement to understanding as an organization what we have that we just haven't unlocked. But then it's doing an inventory to understand what other types of data do we really need to understand and assess this mobility ecosystem. Now, this might be private data that comes from commerce and interactions in our economy, such as where people are having the greatest purchasing, what's happening during specific events, what type of freight is coming in through the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach that might affect the entire ecosystem of travel in the region. Those are different types of factors that we may not really think about today, but that we need to continue to have access to understand how the suite of services that are being offered in our public right-of-way are working and meeting the needs of our city. The second is focused really on leveraging design and technology to enhance that experience of moving around. So this looks at very analog solutions, like creating a more legible city by making it easier to understand that Los Angeles is one of 88 cities in a very complex county. So we have a lot of different systems operating within the city of Los Angeles, and it can be very difficult to kind of take that first leap into using public and shared modes because it is difficult to navigate and access. And we also know that there's a lot of tools that we can do to help make and enhance that user experience. Now you can see this is an example of a boy waiting out on the side of the street for a bus. Well, that level of experience is probably very, very minimal. And how do we potentially design a more happy experience for people who are using public transit? What are the basic amenities that we need to be offering people that are using shared modes in this day and age? So if we increasingly include smartphones and digital technologies and platforms as a way to navigate and access and pay for these systems, we may need to consider new amenities, whether it's power or Wi-Fi or other tools such as that. But on the most basic level, why not provide shade? We don't have a lot of rain in Los Angeles. In fact, we haven't had much rain in the last 6 or 7 years, but we certainly do need to think a little bit more about how we elevate that quality of experience for everyone who opts in to the public transit system. But we also need to continue to expand and leverage the transportation systems that we have in place today. And I think that's one thing that we often don't understand when we think about innovation in the public space, is that we have a lot of incredible assets that have been tested, tried, and are working quite well. So how do we continue to leverage that and scale up across the city? So we've had a smart parking program that was quite successful. How do we expand that citywide to make it easier and more efficient and to reduce the vehicle miles traveled for people circulating around the neighborhood trying to find parking? But also, how do we continue to advance the support of greener fleet options by providing data on where this infrastructure is and access and information on the public right-of-way? The City of Los Angeles started installing curbside chargers in the public right-of-way to make it easier for people to find those spots and use them. What other things are in our toolkit that we're already doing today but need to be done at scale to really change the way people behave? The third component I think was really critical, and we're starting to see this as something that every government is really valuing, is the reliance on public-private partnerships to get things done. The reality is our day-to-day demands are so much more greater than the resources that we have available to us, and often the problems are much more complex than we have the capacity to handle. So we need to seek out these public-private partnerships as an alternative way to get things done. And I think that prevents a lot of challenges. So first of all, you need to set a level playing field and make it easy to engage the government as a whole. So how do we think about how we structure partnerships and procurement processes to enable others to play in this space in a way that is still fair and still preserves our core values around safety, equity, and access? But then the other kind of a part of that is also thinking about how we may extend our reach and services as a public transit agency into neighborhoods that may not be well served by the traditional transit models by connecting them through partnerships with other providers in the private space that can help extend our reach, but create a cohesive experience for the community to get around the city. So we recommend things like looking at our transportation demand management ordinance, which is something that's just been started and is underway, looking at ways to make it easier for people to partner with the city, and then we're developing a shared mobility action plan, which goes into specific recommendations around the rules and regulations that we currently have. So for example, we have a very slow market for car sharing in the city of Los Angeles because we don't have a permit for it. So there is no on-street parking allowed for car sharing services. But the advantage we have is that there's a lot of other cities who've been quite successful in this, so we can continue to glean and learn from what others have done and apply it in kind of the best and greatest form as the City of Los Angeles to make sure that we meet the needs of our community. But we also need to dedicate staff resources to partnerships. For example, the City of Los Angeles partnered with Google Waze quite early to provide event enclosure information to the application to help people navigate around the city. But not having a single person manage that relationship meant that the opportunities that we had as a city to benefit from the partnership were often going by the wayside. So not only in creating a position or the opportunity and responsibility for an individual to manage those relationships, which I think would be very interesting and exciting for any person that's interested in transportation, it also is an opportunity for us to get the most out of these relationships by creating strong and effective project management and clear measures for success, and ultimately allow us as an organization to continue to evolve as we kind of manage how these outcomes can benefit the Department of Transportation as a whole. The fourth core action is looking at this. Once we have collected all this data and have consumed all this data, how do we continue to create feedback loops, not just with the infrastructure that can provide data and information on the conditions and real-time information about congestion and other things that are happening in this mobility ecosystem, but also from our customers themselves. How do we understand where people are and how they're feeling about the services that are available to them, and then adapt on the fly? And I think Andrew mentioned that as well, that there's a real need to create this feedback loop. But we need to understand what the tools are that we have in our toolkit to do that, and then train ourselves as a workforce in terms of how we can actually consume and translate that into action in real time, ultimately to move to being a more responsive city. So just simple things like looking at creating project evaluation standards and creating a user experience working group to start to define what those metrics might look like. But ultimately, how do you implement new tools for ongoing infrastructure assessment as well as for service assessment? And then the fifth action focuses on this automated future, because we know that there's a lot of interest in this, and as a car-centric city, we seek incredible opportunity. We may not have the weather, but we certainly have a topography that would be really interesting as a place to see this technology introduced at scale. So we advocate for LADOT and others to continue to work for greater innovation in this space at the state level to ensure that we are creating a place where people do want to come and work with us. But we've also decided that it would be really good to develop an AV business plan around what the role of the city is in converting its own fleet, whether public transit vehicles or operational vehicles, into automated. So one of the benefits of having a fellowship such as this is that it often attracts new resources to the table. And so we created a partnership with the Fuse Corps to create a new fellowship starting next month for someone to come in, a mid-career professional, to develop a business plan. And they will look at the consequences of converting our public transit fleet or our operational fleet to automated and what that will look like, and help develop a roadmap for that. So the advantage, again, of a public-private partnership is that sometimes these ideas bring more people to the table and more resources and capacity, and that's something that we saw throughout the course of my fellowship, is that we all of a sudden had a catalyst for these new opportunities to come to the table. And then we're going to continue to advance the connected vehicle and infrastructure that we need to have to support our fleet of vehicles that are currently operating in the city. So the City of Los Angeles has a very comprehensive traffic management center called ATSAC, designed in the 1980s to support the Olympics. There hasn't been a ton of changes in the technologies themselves over the last 30 years. However, we know that if we could continue to layer on to that traffic management center other types of data, we'd have a more complete picture of what's happening on our public right-of-way. Currently, we understand volume of vehicles quite well. We have synchronized lights. We can understand how to move people through the city quite efficiently, but that's only focused on the car. So we need a little bit more information, because we are trying to create a better and more balanced public right-of-way that supports pedestrians and cyclists and transit at scale. So we're looking at how we evolved ATSAC into a 21st century traffic management center. And with that is not just about information that we understand to manage the system, but information that we might have a value to provide out as an agency to the vehicles that are moving through the city that can make it safer and more efficient to move around. Now, I think one of the kind of core outcomes was really, how do we pull all this together in a way that would work for the agency to kind of get their head around as they're defining their strategic plans as a department in the future. So these three core services I mentioned earlier were something that we decided we would focus on. Data as a service is this idea that the future is about data, and we need to be equipped to provide in real time the rapid exchange of this information to a variety of providers, whether it's the private sector, for private operators of services that may need information about when transit systems are arriving at a station so they can provide a more coordinated experience, or maybe it's with other government agencies within the region, so that when we have all of these 88 cities convening at various points across the city of Los Angeles, that there's interoperability between these systems and there's an even exchange of information. Ultimately, the idea was to define specific pilots that would allow us to test what data as a service might look like in the near term. So simple things like looking at crowdsourced data and how that helps us really understand the impacts of things like road diets and protected bike lanes on congestion. So we can get out of this, yeah, no, this is what we really think is going to work conversation with communities as we make changes to the public right-of-way, to this is what the numbers are showing us. Because that type of conversation is on a completely different level when you want to build stakeholder buy-in. But we also want to look at how we can test these new tools to create those feedback loops. And ultimately, how can we test and deploy connected infrastructure at scale by focusing in on specific areas within the city? With a city as large as Los Angeles, it can be really challenging to cover everything with once. And if we want to see what the cumulative impact of multiple services are in this kind of new future, we need to apply multiple strategies in the same place. So focusing in on our promise zones, which are designated areas of great economic opportunity, but certainly have a very challenging road ahead. How do we help move those people more efficiently by layering multiple systems in on it? And I think that's a great opportunity to test challenges around language and cultural barriers, the digital divide, but also looking at a very transit-dependent community as an opportunity to focus in on some of these new technologies. The second core service is mobility as a service, and I think with the US DOT challenge, I think we became very familiar with what this concept would be. But this, again, this idea, single platform to access multiple modes of transportation, because really it's about providing us with more choice as a consumer. Because I have different needs as a mom with 2 kids in car seats during certain times of the day than I do when I'm working and on my own and need to move to a meeting. So those providing someone like me a single platform and a single mechanism to pay for any mode of service allows me the flexibility that I need from day to day, from hour to hour over the course of a week. So we want to start with incremental steps. We are launching mobility hubs, which is actually a physical co-location of multiple transportation services in a single place. So it's kind of the analog physical version of what mobility as a service is intended to be. But that will also be supported by a transportation tool, technology, to connect and coordinate all of these services. So it'll be a very easy place for us to get started. We also want to look at things like on-demand transit for our lower density neighborhoods. Now there's a huge misconception that LA is low density. We actually have high density through all of our suburbs, but the problem is that the different scales of these communities make it very difficult to provide the same service at scale across the entire city. So we have to be able to customize and localize these services in real time to really match demand and need with appropriate resources. And then we want to try to figure out how do we expand these sharing services that we see that are very much enabled by technology, but are often across the digital divide to lower income communities, because they're the folks that may benefit the most from from a reduced need to own a vehicle. And finally, infrastructure as a service. And I definitely think this is the crazy idea that perhaps may have the most resistance. But it's thinking a little bit differently about how we currently fund and access our infrastructure. We see infrastructure as a right, as something that we're able to use no matter what. But the reality is that we are no longer funding it adequately, and we have a lot of challenges in meeting those needs. So this thinks about that pay-as-you-go model in lieu of a gas tax as a way of aligning the costs of how we use our infrastructure to what's actually being built and supported by the city. Now, there's a lot of different approaches to how this might be done, and at the state, they are testing a road charge pilot right now. I have a little thing in my car that not only tells me where and how long I'm driving, but gives me some really good telemetrics, so my poor husband, who has to drive all the time, now has a backseat driver even when no one else is in the car. But certainly, it's a really interesting tool that we're waiting to see what happens at the statewide level, because those decisions will ultimately have to come at the statewide level in terms of public policy. But in the interim, we want to see what tools and technology we can leverage to deploy temporary car-free zones within our city. How can we test assumptions around capacity and utilization? One of my policy recommendations is that we never expand a road ever again within the city of Los Angeles, that we are at capacity for that, but we need to figure out how to use it more effectively. So we need to be able to manage and measure that information in real time. And then ultimately, looking at how we could develop a network for AVs, which is something that I know Lauren mentioned, which is building up that connected infrastructure to enable that other layer of information so that the vehicles themselves are not solely responsible for providing all the information to that vehicle, but that they can rely on the redundancy of information from the infrastructure as a safety mechanism. So how could we potentially pilot congestion pricing on our city streets to incentivize shared modes and potentially create pathways for these automated vehicles in the future? So we have quick summary, which is a nice lightweight thing you can print. online, and then we have this honkin' thing, which is the manual, which goes into the why and each of the recommendations and quite a bit of specifics about best practices from around the country and the world. And you can check that all out at urbanmobilityla.com. Or you can find me and email me, and I can send you a link as well. But thank you very much for your time today.
We're almost at time, but I know there's probably at least a couple of questions out there that people have, so I'm going to ask that you be very brief with your questions and any precluding statements that you might have. Yes, sir.
Two questions to one is, you're talking about car-centric LA, but you're also investing billions of dollars right now in transit and asking voters to invest more. So what about that huge sunk investment? Number two, what about the sense of place? I haven't heard a lot about that. What could we do to make our cities also, I mean, because also transportation is just a means, right?
Absolutely. So, and you know, with 15 minutes and a year's worth of study, it's a little unfair to the strategy itself. In terms of Measure M, which is the upcoming ballot initiative we'll see in November, I would argue that this type of approach actually is very supportive of mass public transit, particularly fixed rail, which will always be very important for moving large volumes of people out of our densest urban cores. And we have multiple urban cores in the city of Los Angeles. So certainly building out that network and connecting that network where there are considerable gaps, as it is today, is something that we need to invest in, and that takes many, many years. What this does do, however, is it acknowledges that some of the traditional modes of transit that we see in the public space right now are evolving, and that we're figuring out how to evolve quickly to meet customer demands in better ways. So, you know, we are seeing things like bus transit is a very strong presence within the city of Los Angeles, but it's a very narrow set of the population that actually uses bus transit. So how do we continue to attract more people into using shared modes that can continue to be more efficient in moving more people? It may take different models than the fixed route, fixed schedule approach to bus transit that we know today. So it's acknowledging that these things are happening, but it also takes a step back and says we don't have the tools to really evaluate this ecosystem of services in a way that actually allows us to even plan for that future. So we're setting the baseline now so that as this investment continues over the next 3 decades, we're better equipped to respond. And to the second question about place, as an architect, I think our streets and our public right-of-way are one of our greatest opportunities to create a sense of place. And certainly, one of the things that we talk about, that whole idea of transportation, happiness, and the Mayor's LA Great Streets program is really about redefining public space in our roadways and using it in a different way that improves the quality of experience, whether you're moving through a neighborhood or you're in the neighborhood itself. And so that's something that I think we're very conscientious about, and certainly have adopted new design guidelines for our public right-of-way and other things to ensure that we are making better choices. We also have a Recode LA effort underway, and we talked a lot about how do we think about access to buildings, for instance. So as someone who walks and has a double stroller with me, it can be very difficult to go up to a building where the only point of entry or the main point of entry into a building is through a parking garage. So we need to think about how do we adjust our curb space definitions and our building facades to really be more responsive to multiple modes of transportation. Because it's not just about providing bike infrastructure and wider sidewalks, but it's how do you access the services and needs that you might have within your community.
We'll take one more, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and this kind of follows up on that one. So I think all of you use this statistic where it's 95% of crashes can be addressed because it eliminates the human error thing. But then we have a study from Michigan that comes out back in December that shows that driverless cars crash at twice the rate of people. And part of it is the challenge of integrating an automated system and a human system. And traffic is ultimately a social system. How, particularly when we go through this mixed fleet period, how are we going to address that? And also, how are we going to address the fundamental dynamics of cities where you've got people, and no matter how you automate a car, it still has physical limitations like stopping sight distance and these sorts of things, that there's no way to design that out. I mean, person walks into the street, the car's got to stop. There's a certain amount of time it needs to do that. I mean, what are the processes that are being used to address these conflicts between real life people, and we're not going to be able to get rid of them as much as we like, and driverless vehicles?
I think that's really interesting. One of them has to do with sort of one of the strategies for managing that interaction between humans and automated vehicles is actually developing strategies for the automated vehicles to signal what they're going to do. And there's a lot of sort of research into what that might look like. There are some manufacturers that are looking at actually something that will display a crosswalk in front of the vehicle that'll shine that on the ground if a pedestrian is confused about whether or not the driverless car knows that they're there and that they're prepared to allow them to cross. Other companies are looking at different types of signaling, aspects in terms of putting like signs on their vehicles, or putting lights on their vehicles that indicate that it's in an automated driving mode, or that what it's doing is safe. I think it's maybe a little bit too early to say prescriptively what that should look like, but definitely that has been a concern so far, is that the automated vehicles and the human-driven vehicles are not always aware of what each other are doing.
And yeah, I saw a really interesting presentation by one of the automakers that showed how the culture of cities actually will influence how the technology is designed too, and how they showed a crosswalk in, I believe it was Iran, and it showed the cars just funneling through and people literally dodging cars to get across the street, and that's completely normal. I mean, there were women with babies, doing this, and the cars did not slow down at all. And then you see a US city where the cars immediately stop and let the people cross. So the cars actually have to learn how to adapt to the different cultures. Say learn, get programmed to be able to do that. But just in general, I think there's going to be a huge learning curve on both sides, both for humans and on all the technology developers. And it's not going to be perfect, and I'm sure it's going to get messy. And my fear is that there is going to be a catastrophic accident and it could completely derail the development of this technology, which is unfortunate, because there was a study done asking people if you knew that there was going to be this huge reduction in accidents, but there's still going to be some accidents and they're going to be caused by these robots. Are you okay with it? And most people said no. And so there's going to be a real kind of dialogue for people as they adapt. That being said, apparently, and I wasn't here for this, but when elevators were introduced, there was an equal kind of freaking out by society. And now look at us today, we don't even think about it. So I think that we'll probably get there. It's just going to be an interesting time for the transition years.
Sorry. This has been a great discussion. Thank you all for being here. Just so you know, this session is one of the sessions that's been videoed, so there will be a link to this on the website. Renato would definitely grab me if I don't mention this. There are cookies and posters section during the break, which is right outside these doors, and all these folks' contact information will be available as well. Thank you so much.